Putin's decision will make the world cry. After his shocking attack, the world wondered how far the Russian political leader was willing to go. Russian experts from all over the world look forward to the next development for us. As Russian troops pile on the Ukrainian border this week, a mystery that has haunted the world for months receives an immediate and startling response. Does Russian President Vladimir Putin really want war? The full attack on Ukraine on Wednesday night answered that question and then raised another, more confusing question. What will happen to it? How far will it go? In a speech he called Special Military Operations, Putin made it clear that he wanted to tighten his grip on Ukraine and expected a confrontation with the West and NATO. How it plans to go and what the real reason is will help build America and the West and determine how far this conflict will go. To see where this conflict is headed and what makes a leader with a deep history of discontent and nuclear waste more independent, Politico contacted several experts, including Russia, who all recognize Putin as their current leader. Time, former diplomats and other people who came into direct contact with him, and experts with ideas from outside the United States and Europe. The good news is that many see the limits of Putin's goals. The bad news, these restrictions go far beyond the international order we live in. So they say. It is now clear that Putin's ultimate goal is nothing more than imperialist revanchism, to change the world in order to control the entire former Soviet Union. It completely ignores international law, norms, and human rights that can only be limited by the highest level of economic, political, and military power. Russia is a completely bad state, along with North Korea and Iran. Now we have a responsibility to protect the people and government of Ukraine and help them secure their plane and pay for the attack. We must also take the strictest measures against Russia, including economic sanctions. We can minimize the impact on our friends and partners who depend on Russian oil and gas by bringing oil to Berlin, and doing everything we can to prevent this war from spreading to NATO territory and world war. Whether Putin really has an end is still unclear to the outside world. For the last few months, he's been deliberately deceiving people so that people don't see his true purpose. He recently hinted at an operation to defend the separatist zone in eastern Ukraine before ordering a major nationwide offensive. So he's not sure what his regional ambitions are. Yet he declared the demilitarization and saintization of Ukraine. This means that at the very least Ukraine wants to destroy its military infrastructure and replace its government with a puppet government. When Vladimir Putin announced the Russian invasion of Ukraine in a television speech on Thursday, he spoke of a goal that went far beyond Russia's previous attacks on him, its Ukrainian neighbors. In a sweeping and angry speech, Putin described the conflict as a conflict against the entire West. Putin's false statement that the West wants to use Ukraine as a springboard to corrupt and destroy Russia is too detailed to be dismissed as a naive belief. Not like last week, sir. Putin spent little time repeating false stories about Ukraine's atrocities against the country's Russian-speaking minority. The petitions support his decision to recognize Russia-backed separatist forces as an independent state, which has controlled parts of eastern Ukraine since 2014, which he intervened to prevent. Instead, he defined the war as a preemptive offensive against Western aggression and a decisive battle to defend Russia's imperial rule in the East. Here is a summary of key passages from his speech. Mr. Putin sees the decision to invade Ukraine as a last resort to fend off Western aggression near the Russian border. Since the end of the Cold War, some Eastern European countries have chosen to join NATO as military allies of Moscow's former Western rivals. In 2008, Washington asked NATO to announce that it would one day consider including Ukraine, but Western leaders said they did not see that happening anytime soon. Especially in recent weeks, Mr. Putin has called NATO enlargement a way to destroy Russia. Described diplomatic efforts that began late last year after Russia launched a large military presence on the Ukrainian border to maintain a stable balance in Europe and avoid war. In fact, the demands of the Russian delegation are so fierce that they are viewed as chemical weapons designed to disrupt negotiations. Western intelligence agencies said Putin considered the intervention weeks or months in advance. We cannot stand by these developments. This is absolutely not our responsibility. For our country, this is a matter of life and death and the future of our country. This is a real threat not only to our interests, but to the life and governance of our country. This is a red line that we have discussed many times. They got over it. In diplomatic failure, Putin claimed he had no choice but to save Russia from a hostile solution with the West since the end of the Cold War. He deduced the ethnic narrative of lost imperial grandeur, the almost false historical narrative of the West's two facets in Eastern Europe that made his wish, and long-term growth, which Russian scholars believe is good. The dissolution of the Soviet Union led to the redivision of the world. This series contains the promise that NATO will not expand an inch to the east. To reiterate, they lie to us or simply play with us. Putin spent much of his speech talking about the history of the last 30 years of false promises of the West to divide Europe, by maintaining a stable balance between the US and the Russian side. He implied that this proved that the West was determined to block and control Russia and could only withdraw by force. Along the beautiful white stone buildings, fathers push cotton carts for the children to walk in the morning, and dog owners take their pets for a walk uptown street leads to shops selling handicrafts, fur coats, and movie posters. Not far from this beautiful place where you can imagine the well-dressed Hugh Grant walking, there is something unexpected. Walking towards Kensington Gardens one morning, you pass a quiet white mansion. The building reflects Regency splendor but lacks sophistication. The Russian embassy in London is hidden behind barbed wire, fences, and high brick walls. All windows were rendered unusable with curtains and iron bars, barriers extended to the pavement, and cameras targeted passers-by. The embassies are not very welcoming, but in February 2023, the Russian embassy is like a big sleeper in the garden of Kensington Palace. The Ukrainian embassy can be found a few blocks east. Apart from the Ukrainian flag and plaque waving at the entrance, it is indistinguishable from the other buildings in Holland Park. The shutters were not drawn and the fences were not drawn. There is a war going on in Ukraine, but you can tell from the flowers and flags outside the door and the messages of support. Judging from the photographs alone, the embassies tell two very different stories about the relationship between the two countries and the UK and the West as a whole. On February 24th, the first anniversary of the war in Ukraine, the street in front of the Russian embassy was painted blue and gold. Hundreds of protesters gathered in the streets against the Russian government and the ongoing protests. It is clear that most of the protesters are British, not Ukrainian.